好，欢迎大家来。今天我们新泽西还是冰天雪地的，然后看到这么多朋友能来参加，真的很感谢，也非常感谢我们的 Panelists。还有德州的朋友也过来哈，希望你们这个最艰难的日子这2天已经过去了，也欢迎你们。然后呢，先感谢一下我们的 sponsor， 我们每次的活动还有年会都有business sponsors， 有 DOC， 有 World Youth Union， 还有GLA Global Leaders Academy， 应该可以先试一下。So， 然后有仲宇和楼兰顾问团。徐明是我们的 volunteer， 我们幕后他也在支持我们，比如说世界日报哈都帮我们连续去宣传，然后胡志宇律师事务所，还有酷中文。说到 sponsor， 当然更要感谢一下我们今年的3位会长哈，魏红、Hannah 和 Linda， 这个 sponsorship 这些事情也一直都是你们在联系啊，在商量啊，所以也很费心。我们 PCE 呢，大家很多朋友已经熟悉了哈，是一个非盈利、非宗教、非政治的组织，然后真的是靠我们 volunteer 这么18年来组织了将近现在199场约会了，大家也看到哈，就是很多都是这个大家的热情。那我们主要呢是从 EQ Parenting 的角度来讲，因为我们觉得华裔的父母呢很多关注子女的学习有这些 support， 但是在情商育儿上呢会相对弱一点那我们大家一起学习成长呢就是一个很好的平台，也能改善跟子女的关系哈，尤其到青少年的时候会有更多的交流，更有效的那个影响到孩子的成长。这个情商育儿的3要素呢是第一个是良好的亲子关系哈，这些都是廖冰老师总结出来的他是我们的创始人之一，大家可以去 YouTube 上找他的那个讲座，我们非常推荐。那他的3要素呢，第一个是良好的亲子关系，第二个呢是支持唤醒孩子的内驱力，第3个呢是接受不完美，不管是我们自己在育儿上面或者是孩子的不完美。那么快的介绍一下我们的活动形式呢，也是有很多种的。大家如果想了解具体的呢，可以去我们的网站上。然后中间我们会有Hannah 会帮我们准备那个微信的扫码群，大家也可以进微信再了解更多哈。简单的说呢，我们有月会，然后有年会，每年大概10月份、11月份，请大家关注。然后是有针对 PCE members 呢，我们有专门组织 PCE 的国际亲密治理小组的学习这个呢我们也是很推荐大家可以去他们的网站，是西北大学心理学教授黄威仁博士开发的这个课程，非常的能够从全面提升我们的情商和个人成长。另外呢，在5、6月份的时候呢 ，PCE 会请到台湾的罗志忠老师来给我们做一次对话课程的讲座，这个也是 members only， 这是在我们的副会长Linda 在联系。然后呢，我们会有原创的文章公众号 EQ Parenting 哈，这个等会也可以扫码。还有 Book Club 是 Hannah 在组织，最后我们的微信群呢，目前也有好几个群了，2000多人，所以大家就非常感谢大家，真的是会宣传我们的工作，然后让更多的家庭来听到来受益。最后呢，说一下我们马上之后的几次活动哈。这一期系列的活动呢是 Laura 哈，是我们的这个总导演、总策划，一忙3个月，辛苦。这一系列活动做完之后呢，我们会有一次专门给华裔父母做的职场讲座哈，可能1期或者2期。这个呢，因为我们觉得情商育儿也真的不是在真空当中哈，我们的工作压力呢有时候会影响到我们的亲子关系，所以我希望找到一个比较全面的一个讲员哈，能够专门针对我们需要的一些 support 来讲。那另外呢，就是刚才说到的，对这个5、6月份的那个对话课程呢，它是用的萨提亚的冰山模式，就是我们常常觉得想跟孩子好好说，经常这个脾气就上来了那我们的行为呢，常常 之后呢是有很多在冰山下面是有很多不同的 layers。如果我们学习了这样的课程呢，希望的话就更了解我们自己和孩子行为情绪背后的一些想法啊，或者一些更深层次的一些渴望，这样呢就能更好的改善我们自己的状况，也改善跟孩子的相处那就是这样快快的介绍一下，中间呢会那个会有扫码的，然后呢最后呢也希望大家能留下来稍微讨论讨论哈。我知道我们本来说希望能每次组织一个讨论，但是现在因为太精彩的活动，这个Laura在3个星期就请来这么多 Panelists 跟我们分享他们的实践哈讨论，所以呢我们就赶快把这个 floor 交给 Panelists 哈。Laura 你要稍微介绍一下吗？谢谢你啊，辛苦辛苦。
谢谢建平。对，我知道我们今天是很宝贵，但是呢，我想我们上一个月的那个讲座是特别精彩，而且呢，我想如果我花2分钟来介绍一下上一次的那个3位嘉宾讲的要点，可能对我们的年轻人也有帮助哈，所以我来 try 一下，这个真的就是特别快的讲一下，我们上次关于这个 Chinese American Identity 的一个讨论的一些要点。好 ，sorry， 我来 share 一下。
谢谢你啊 ，Laura， 你辛苦准备的太多东西了，我觉
得。都是大家这个群策群力。Okay, so yes, so I'm gonna just take 2 minutes to run through like the highlights of our previous panel discussion. So first, Professor Lu Ying, talked about the identity wheel, the multiple dimensions of an individual's identity. I think the ultimate goal is for each individual to fully realize his or her talents and potentials for that self-actualization. So we want to keep this in mind, and we don't want like anyone to be kind of flattened or reduced in any way because of race, ethnicity, or cultural backgrounds. And then our second panelist last time was Duan Lian. She talked about like the youth development and how that plays into the youth development. So like the best status is identity achievement. You have that awareness. You you fully considered the options, and you made a conscious choice that gives you the ultimate drive and self-motivation. Like, and then there are different status of identity development. Our third panelist from last time, 台静强老师. So his section was also very well received. So he talked about we are all like bicultural, like we live in a multicultural world, but we are mostly bicultural, and we want to have the best of both worlds, and we want to absorb the strengths of both cultures and achieve bicultural confidence. So we don't want to diminish either side of us. So I think one goal of this 2-panel discussion of PCE is that we hope to start to learn together and to develop together and achieve that bicultural confidence. I also borrowed 2 slides from this panel talk. Many of our PCE members watched and listened. It was a seminar from an organization in Connecticut. They really did a wonderful job, highlighting the Chinese American history and where we are today. And they just, they explained the 2 main biases that kind of worked against us. one of them perpetual foreigner stereotype, and the other one, the model minority myth. So we, as parents, we want to teach our children from early on that these biases are, are like, there's nothing wrong with them when they encounter something negative like this. We can help them understand that these biases have historical roots, and through learning and education, and hopefully also educate other people, we can work together to reduce these biases. Yeah, but the learning should start with us, with ourselves. So yeah, so that is my, my attempt at capture our wonderful panel talk from last time. So now I'm turning the stage to our youth panelists. So thanks so much. I think we said Jim will lead, right? Thank you.
So I'm just going to start by introducing myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Moo, and I am a second-year doctoral student at the Rutgers Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. I'm currently working with middle school students in the Perth Amboy School District. And I guess one fun fact about me being Chinese American is that I'm addicted to boba tea, and I got all of my friends to fall in love with it as well, and I'm very proud. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Kyle. I'm a recent graduate from Southern Methodist University, and I studied computer science. And recent fun fact about myself being Asian American is I think I've been back to China like 6 times now already. And most of the times I went back, I was with family, and then recently I went back by pretty much by myself on a school trip. So I have a lot of different perspectives on what it's like being Chinese as well as being an American. One of the things that I'm kind of talk about is that the relationship between Asian Americans and other minorities and cultural groups, especially those of predominantly white Americans. I grew up in the South, so I have stereotypically it's like dominated, by a little more conservative beliefs among American individuals. And starting in middle school, I went to a private school, and I was the only Asian student in my entire grade, and like one of the few only Asian students in the entire school. And this continued into high school when I still went to a private high school, and I was just one of the few Asians in the entire grade/school. So I feel like I offer a little bit of different perspective on this. One of the things is that when I was a kid growing up, I feel like I definitely hung out with mostly Asian kids, like be it my family friends and stuff like that. And then obviously going into middle school, I couldn't do that anymore because I was the only Asian student in the school. So one of the things that I feel like I kind of learned, although I feel like I'm going to probably be addressing this mainly to the younger people, although I don't know how many younger people are in this call. So is that being an Asian American or just Asian or Chinese, you offer a different perspective and a different kind of experience and background than majority of Americans. So instead of trying to fit in as much as you can and say like, oh, if I'm the only Asian kid, I'm just going to act as white as possible to fit into my with the school, is that you should be proud of your heritage and your cultural background, and you shouldn't shy away from it. Even if people call you weird or think what you do is kind of strange, or maybe your lunch is weird, you should encourage them to try it or something like that, because or offer them to give them a little taste. Sorry, I don't really understand your question at the moment. But for example, is like I had an incident when I was in school. Is I brought dumplings to lunch, and people told me it smelled, and I started crying because I was like, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. So
Okay, so one of the incidents is somebody made fun of my lunch. I started crying, and then eventually one of my friends that was also Chinese helped me get over it. But then looking back, I realized that like one of the things that you could do is you could offer to try it, because then later on people started asking me like, oh, hey, you brought dumplings, can I have one? Because they really liked them. So like generally people in this, like the younger people of our generations are generally more open-minded and willing to try new things. And if you expose them to newer cultures at a younger age, then they're going to be more tolerant and accepting of whatever background you may come from. And the worst thing you could do is try and act like you're not from your culture, and you should embrace it, but you shouldn't let it completely define you. As in, like, you shouldn't think that, oh, just because I'm Asian or Chinese, I can only hang out with other Asians or Chinese people. You should be willing to hang out with everyone, from whatever background they can be. Like, they don't have to just be white Americans. You should be willing to hang out with Hispanic people, Black people, anything. And that you should encourage people to understand and experience your culture and background, and hopefully that gives them a better attitude, and it opens their eyes, just so they don't say some racist things or behave in a certain prejudiced way against you. And one of the most important things I'd say is you just have to always stay positive, even when like people say some really, really harsh, mean things. Like, I've experienced racism directly to my face, and one of the things is, like, I feel like there's several options when that happens, when because I grew up in a high school with almost all white kids, is that people would either treat you as like, oh, you're just like the model minority, like you're one of the cool people, or you're just like this weird Asian kid. And when they're racist to you, you can either laugh it off and say like nothing happened, which I don't think is the best response. You could go become belligerent, which I also don't think is the best response. Or you could just say like, hey, that's really not that nice, and you should explain to them why what they're doing is wrong. And because, like, generally speaking, most people that are like have prejudices against other people don't really notice like they're being prejudiced until like you call them out on it. And a lot of people think it's okay to be racist against Asian Americans. Like, it's just very loosely thrown around, and you should just remind people that, hey, like, I don't have to be good at math or something like that, because that was something that I commonly experienced. And that one thing that you have to remember, and I feel like this is the most important thing, is that you shouldn't try and be something you're not, right? People are always going to see your skin or your face and know that you're an Asian, right? So you shouldn't act like you're not and try and convince or trick other people, even yourself, into just like being someone that you are just like, oh yeah, I'm just like, just act as white as possible, don't even speak Chinese. Because when I was younger, I didn't like speaking Chinese. I like to speak English. But then getting older, I started speaking Chinese now, and I use chopsticks and I do stuff, and it's just accepting, like, from where I come from and who I
am. Kyle, I think you need to wrap up.
Yeah, so basically that's kind of like my concluding points, is that you shouldn't really forget who you are, but you should also like not let it become a single issue defining who you are. Like, you shouldn't think that I have to do, like, I can only be Chinese, because you're also an American. So, and you should also understand that includes you have to be tolerant of other people as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Great point. So we have Aliyah next. I would like to remind the other panelists, if you can also time yourself, that would be great. Like, thank you. So Aliyah, please.
Yeah, hi, my name's Aliyah. I'm a third year student at Occidental College, undergraduate. And currently I'm working with elementary school students in Eagle Rock County to help with their education. Okay. I'm fairly certain I signed up for question 1, although I can't see the graph anymore, so I'm not certain. Oh, Michelle, let me see too. Okay. But for me, being Chinese American is finding a way to meld my Chinese heritage with my American surroundings. And this has definitely evolved a lot as I've grown older and matured. Well, Kyle brought this up in great detail, but between the ages of 3 and 4 is when children usually start to kind of break out from their parents and seek peer relations with other people in their lives, particularly for school. And it's around elementary school when I think most Asian Americans experience like what I like to call the Lunchbox Incident, which is exactly what Kyle explained. Like you have dumplings or you have this weird like Asian snack that you think is normal, and that's the food is a symbol and a representation of your Chinese heritage, and you grow up proud and happy that you have such a unique culture with such wonderful food and wonderful traditions. But once that incident occurs where peers that you might consider friends, that you might want to be friends with, like they voice a rejection to it. So like, ew, that's weird, that's gross, how can you eat that? Like that looks so weird. How can you possibly find that appealing? Things like that. And so that creates an association, a negative association with your food, which is your culture, and other people. And by other people, I mean rejection, isolation, that sort of thing, rejection of peers. And so that can oftentimes manifest itself into a rejection of culture, which is what Kyle stated. And for me, that went like all the way. Like I didn't want to be Asian anymore. I refused to go to Chinese school. I didn't want to eat my mom's food, which really hurt her feelings at the time. But, you know, I didn't care because I wanted to fit in. And so I think that the image of Asian Americans in general has been improving over the past few years, especially with the rise in popularity of K-pop and anime, even though that's not Chinese, but that's bolstered the Asian American identity a lot. And unfortunately, with the pandemic, the resentment against Asian Americans has suddenly spiked. And we see this reflected in the amount of Asian hate crimes across the country. And so I feel like this identity of Asian American culture and the Asian American identity is really hindered by this new wave of xenophobia and anti-Asian rhetoric that a lot of people consume, because the stress and the anger that people contribute to COVID-19 is being kind of scapegoated into our ethnicity, which it's not right, but it's what's happening. And so I feel like until the pandemic we can put that behind us, I feel like right now the Asian American identity is kind of locked in with the association with all the negative emotions. And once we get past that, then we can continue to like bring a positive association back with the Asian American identity.
Yeah. Thank you, Alia. Yes, that's a great point. You know, right now it's definitely a very sort of like a touch point for, for Asian American issues. Yes. So next we have Annie.
Hi, everyone. I'll be here to answer questions, but I thought I might just screen share a pre-recorded talk I did, and I can answer any questions you have in the chat live.
Oh, great. Yeah, we can see your screen.
Let me know if you can see and hear everything okay? Hi, my name is Annie, and I am a senior at Vassar College, double majoring in education and media studies. A recent project that I've been working on is my senior thesis, and I am writing about Asian American experiences with sex education. And a fun fact about me relating to my Chinese identity is that I watched all 81 episodes of 芈月传 over the winter break. It was very long, but it was good. So I wanted to start my talk by thinking about the term Chinese American, because I think it can be easily summed up to someone of Chinese descent growing up or living in the US. But I wanted to take a minute to think about what does this really mean, because I think that's a very sort of reductive way of thinking about it. And our lived experiences as adolescents are very complicated because we grow up in a constant back and forth between bicultural Chinese and American settings. Some people might call it code switching. I don't personally call it that, but I can understand why. So because when we're growing up and we're going to school, we're too Chinese to be American, right? Other students make fun of our lunches. They ask us to parrot words in Chinese just to prove that we can, because we're so foreign to them, even though we were born and raised in the US just like them. We aren't represented in school curriculum like at all. We're not represented in US history other than maybe Chinese exclusion and Japanese internment. We're not represented in reading lists. Like I remember from my experience growing up, in Nebraska, I only read books written by white authors. That was it. And that environment is often pretty harsh for us because it makes it difficult for us to want to be Chinese when we're young, because we want to fit in and be accepted by our non-Asian peers, but we inherently can't because we don't look like them. But then on the other hand, with relatives, we're too American to be Chinese. We don't mind being tan. Sometimes we speak broken Chinese, but we essentially carry our Americanness with us. And even though we are welcomed by our relatives to a certain degree, there are things that make us different. And so we don't completely interact fluidly with them. So I guess this process of bicultural settings is kind of how we end up becoming Chinese American. And I also want to talk about Asian American invisibility in media, because that really adds to the context of us having to look for piecemeal representation. It's gone significantly better in recent years with, the rise of Crazy Rich Asians and its movies following its release. But it's a similar deal. In American media, we can't really see ourselves because we're either often side characters or very stereotypical portrayals. We don't see ourselves as part of the American narrative. But then if we seek out Chinese or Asian media, it's kind of the reverse, where we can see our faces and people who look like us on screen, but they don't sound or act like us. So we don't feel really represented by them either. And so again, this communicates the message that one person cannot exist as Chinese and American simultaneously. I think about how, in comparison to my two best friends who are also Chinese American from Nebraska, I speak the most Chinese, and yet it's still difficult for me. And I don't think I really embraced the term Chinese American until college. I've had different challenges kind of arise in my romantic relationships and different work settings because of a sort of perpetual foreignness. But I'm not going to get into that because that would be way too long. But to conclude, I'm proud to be Chinese American now, but I think growing up, it would have been much easier to arrive at this state that I'm in if more people around me had told me that it was okay to be Chinese and American at the same time, instead of treating me as like too Chinese or too American in different places, and just accepting that I've had a different lived experience than one side or the other. And I think it's especially important now in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic with the rise of anti-Asian sentiment that we really need to have solidarity in our Asian communities and especially with other communities of color too. So I'm grateful for this panel today, and I just wanted to say that we need to be having these conversations because Chinese Americans don't need to prove that they deserve to be in the US or that their families deserve to be in the US or that they are virus-free. And I think a lot of this can be combated if we help kids from an early age who are going through this experience understand that they will have a lot of conflicts culturally in their lives, and that's perfectly okay because they're going to develop their own distinct identity, but we just need to convey the message that it's okay to be both Chinese and American.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. And thank you for taking the time to really prepare and rehearse. Next up, we have Alan.
Sorry, is it my turn? I can't, sorry, my signal is cutting out.
Yes, please, Alan, go ahead.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Alan. I graduated from Columbia in 2017, so it's been a few years, and I actually used to volunteer for PCE back in high school. That was a long time ago, though. I'll just jump straight to it. I feel like, so regarding the question of a Chinese American identity, I actually don't think it's useful to focus too much on, well, what are the hardships faced as an Asian Chinese American, and what are you going to do about it specifically? I actually think, well, I mean, you all are parents here. That's why you're in this club, I would expect. And there's a reason you're in that club, because you want to raise your children well. And I've been thinking about that question a lot as I get older. And I think, my experience has shown me that I think what a child raised well means is that you end up with a strong child. And by strong, I mean all these following characteristics: virtuous, capable, competent, emotionally regulated, high EQ. And that manifests as, for example, being able to take individual responsibility for your actions and your outcome, and being able to aim at the highest version of yourself, being able to make friends easily and rely on those relationships for help, and being able to make promises or keep to your promises so that other people learn to rely on you and trust you. And these are all the things I think that make somebody strong as an individual. And the reason I want to focus on that is because, and not specifically on the Chinese American identity, is because the Chinese American identity is just one of many, many problems that somebody will face in their life, whether you're Chinese American or white American or any other kind of American. And so, sorry for the noise. I'm in the parking lot resort right now. I walk to my car. But so 邓小平有一句话就是实践是检验真理的唯一标准. And what that means, well, practice is the sole criterion by which to judge theory. And that's about policy, right? But what he's really getting at, and I think what he really understands about the world, is that the world is a very complex place that you cannot predict the things that are going to happen to you, and you cannot correct for all the possible injustices or hardships or challenges that you will face, no matter how well you plan or no matter how well you try to prepare the world for you. So that's why it's important to be strong in all the various aspects that I mentioned, because you will be able to overcome those hardships. And I think if you raise a child well and with those virtues, they will be able to overcome, they will still experience the pain of being an Asian American, of the hardships created by being the children of immigrants in a culture that those immigrants did not grow up in. But that's, like I said, just one of many, many different challenges that they will face in their lives. What kind of friends to make, or what kind of career to choose, or what to do when something really bad happens. The reason you want a strong child is because something could happen to you, for example. I have a friend, for example, whose parents are divorced, and she was going to medical school. And then one day she gets news that her mom has cancer, terminal cancer, and she's going to pass away in a few years. And she has this hard decision to make about whether she should split her time between going to DC and taking care of her mother, finishing medical school, finding a way to do both. A strong individual is going to be able to take care of that. And as a parent, you're not always going to be there for your children. And so I view that concentrating too much on Chinese American identity and the issues that arise from it as being there's a water pipe in your ceiling and it's broken and it's leaking water all over the place, and you have this bucket. You have this bucket that you're using to catch the water. And there's a leak in the bucket, and wow, you're spending all your time focusing on the leak in the bucket when you really should be spending your time on fixing the water pipe. And that means basically, if you make somebody strong and virtuous in all these ways, these issues of Chinese American identity will take care of themselves as one of the many hardships that your child overcomes. And also, one of the things I think is a risk that happens when you concentrate too much on talking or like about these issues is that there's an easy trap to fall into, which I called like the victim mentality trap, which is, I've experienced it myself because, well, for example, my parents are divorced, and then I did not have a happy childhood. And I remember blaming my parents for many, many years about all the ways in which I wasn't raised as well as my peers were and the people who I saw in together whole marriages were. And I let it limit myself in a lot of ways, like in terms of, oh, I'm not successful because of I wasn't raised as well, or I'm not as successful as I could be because I wasn't raised as well. And I think you can fall into that same trap with your Asian identity. It's like, oh, I'm Asian. People are going to like me as much. I'm not going to be as popular. Girls aren't going to like me as much, etc. And I think that's a very, very dangerous trap to fall into, because I think that's a risk that I think anybody who plays around with identity politics or who spends too much time concentrating on that one part of your life is capable of falling into, because then you start viewing the world as this place that just treats you as an Asian American. And that's not the world's responsibility to fix that viewpoint. That's your responsibility, both as an individual and as a parent of that individual, to try to prevent. So that's my summary of my first part. I personally don't have kids, so I don't know all the ways that you can make somebody strong, but I know two things very strongly, which are, one, you as a parent ought to embody the values you want to pass down as much as possible. And I'll go into details why. And second is, like, your relationship with your child is potentially one of the greatest sources of strength in their life, or one of the greatest sources of weakness and misery in their life. And so the first part, why you should need to embody your values, is because, well, people have these things called mirror neurons, and humans are extremely, extremely good at mimicking the actions of other people. And children are especially good at that because, well, they have to, because they don't know anything and they have to learn by copying other people. You see this when you have kids, and your youngest kid copies everything that the older sibling does. But one thing you miss is that, like, they copy everything you do too. Maybe not everything, but they will copy as much as you think. And they will copy both the good behaviors that you exhibit and the bad behaviors that you exhibit. So it's not enough to just lecture your kid. Chinese people have like, oh, 这孩子不听话，你们的孩子怎么那么听话？我真羡慕你们，blah blah blah. But that's like, yes, listening to words is certainly a good trait of a child, but really, children are so good at mimicking that you ought to try to hold yourself to the highest moral and ethical standard in order to let your kid copy you. I know that's hard, but that's one of the things I think is pretty important to jump on, especially as Asian Americans. And the second point, I think, with regard to the relationship that you ought to have with your kid, is that that's a big question actually in Asian American communities, but because they don't always have good relationships. But your relationship with your child can be either something a source of strength in their life, or a source of misery. And by that, I mean that one of the things that makes somebody strong and competent in life and able to weather the hardships and make good decisions is their ability to have deep relationships and their ability to utilize those relationships. And the relationship between parent and child, like, no question about it. That is the most fundamental relationship that exists in society, in life in general. And I think people need to think very carefully about what kind of relationship they want with their child, because when your child is going to face hard decisions about colleges to go to, friends to make, career paths to choose, and face hard problems. Maybe something happens to them. Maybe somebody assaults them or beats them up, or sexually assaults them. Like, terrible things can happen. Things can happen. Are they going to turn to you for advice and support? Or are they going to find desperately something else? And I bring this up because I didn't always have the greatest relationship with my parents. I was angry at them for a long time. But I think I've rebuilt that relationship over many years. And it's only struck me very recently how incredible and such a source of strength your relationship with your father and your mother could be if you put the work into it and made it a source of strength and advice rather than a source of, man, I'm so angry at my parents all day. And so that's just basically my whole point. Like, you should think carefully about your relationship with your child, because it can be one of the greatest things in their life, or it could be not the opposite of that, especially for Asian American parents, I think, because there's a stereotype of the tiger parent who just beats up their kid or just yells at them all day. And they end up being successful nominally, but they're fragile because they don't have an emotional network or support that other people do with their parents. So just be careful about that and think about that. And those are my 3 points.
Okay.
Raising strong kids and embodying your values and thinking about your strong relationship with your child. So okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I think we'd love to invite you back for another, maybe longer version of your talk. Thank you. And also, I think you just set an example of successfully pushing boundaries. All right. So Yihan, thank you.
Sure. What a tough act to follow. 我叫易涵. 大家好. I graduated from college in 2012. I'm currently a product manager at DoorDash. I work on improving the experience for Dashers. So if you ever order food from DoorDash, we're trying to make that experience better all the time. I live in San Francisco with my husband and our 2 cats. And I think we're very lucky to have a lot of great Chinese supermarkets by us. And so with work from home especially, we've been doing a lot of cooking, gotten a lot of Chinese ingredients, make a lot of like yixiangqiezi, dandanmian, mapo tofu and all that, which is fun. To be honest, I, at this point, don't spend very much time thinking about being Chinese American. And I think part of that is just where I'm in life. I've been out of college for 10 years, I'm 30. I'm pretty comfortable with who I am. And so being Chinese American is part of my identity, sure, but so is being a woman and a former consultant and someone who likes to ski and hike and use data to tell stories. I think another part of it is living in San Francisco. There are a lot of Asian Americans around. It is utterly unremarkable to be Chinese American. Whereas when I lived in the Midwest, like growing up, I was for a while like the only Chinese kid in my school. And now currently at work, I think I am the only woman in the meeting much more frequently than I am the only Asian in the meeting. I think it is true, especially in the work world, that people make assumptions about you based on your background and kind of first impressions based on what you look like. And I do think it's really good to be aware of what some of those assumptions are. And being Asian is part of that, but sure, for me, like being a woman is part of it. Being a former consultant and an MBA working in tech is also part of it. And there are, good parts, like things that are helpful and things that are less helpful about the assumptions that people make about you. So for example, in college, I remember running for like a club position. And I think people thought that I was nice, which was good. Sometimes people also thought that I was a pushover, which I don't think was actually true. And people spoke up and said that it wasn't true. But I think, being a small Asian girl in a club with a lot of dudes, a lot of times people will make that assumption about you. Similarly at work, I think when I was first starting out in the work world, like I got feedback that I needed to speak up more in meetings. And if I reflect on that, I think part of that is just like pretty standard feedback that people will often give to people starting out at work when they really can't think of anything else to say. But being an Asian woman, I think also makes people think that that's feedback that you could use, because if you're an Asian woman, you probably don't speak up enough. I mean, I think there are benefits too. People generally give me the benefit of the doubt in terms of like being good at math or being good at numbers. I mean, I don't think I'm bad at math, but I feel like I flubbed some math questions on interviews and people just didn't seem to mind because they assumed that I would be able to do it. And so I think being Asian is a small part of the perception that people have of you, but being at least somewhat aware of that perception is helpful, because it helps me know how to respond and what to do to shape the way that people think about me in a way that I want and I'd find helpful. But on the whole, I think this is a little bit similar to some of what Alan was saying. Like, sure, there are some things that are different about being Asian American, but it's not something that I spend a whole lot of time thinking about now. And I think it helps, and I feel very lucky to be in a place where there are a lot of Asian Americans, work at a company where there are, you know, Chinese Americans and Indian Americans in leadership, and, you know, be in a world today where I think there's a lot more Asian representation on media, and Asians in leading roles in media where they're not defined by being Asian, they're just another person on the show with a lot of different aspects of their identity. So I guess in summary, it's part of who I am, but it doesn't feel like something that has to define me, and it's not something that I feel the need to spend a ton of time thinking about anymore.
Great, thank you so much. And we are all so happy for you for being, you know, in this very good place. Also, let me see, Jinmu, do you want to go now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Sorry for the little hiccup earlier. So I guess my idea of being an Asian American might be a little bit different from the other panelists here, because I was born and raised in China. I didn't come to the US until I was 14. So as I was growing up, everything that I did or all the food that I ate were considered the majority. So I never felt that I was left out. I never felt that, you know, my culture was less than, or like my food was disgusting. But after I came to the US when I was 14, I started high school in the Deep South. So that was quite a culture shock, because I was the only Asian kid in my very, I guess, prestigious Southern private school. Everyone else is white. So that was a very special and interesting experience for me, because all of a sudden, everything that I knew, my culture, my food, my holidays, all of a sudden, all those things were considered the minority. So I had to figure out a way to fit in, but also keep that pride in me of who I am, keep that pride, make sure that I still feel proud of me and my culture and just being a Chinese person. So that went on for 4 years. That was, you know, a very special time. I was confused for quite some time, but eventually I did make my way to college in the North, in New Jersey. So after I came to New Jersey, that was quite a liberating experience, but because I got to know more people in with the same background as me, you know, people that are born and raised in China, or Chinese Americans that grew up in the Chinese culture. So I feel like, you know, once again, I'm able to enjoy all the things that I used to enjoy with other people that I know they're enjoying the same thing as me. So that was a very, like I said, a very enjoyable and liberating experience. So one of the questions that Laura prepared was that how can the school systems in the US like better support Asian American students and like, I guess, continue the conversation of Asian American issues and problems. I personally feel from my experience in being in school as a student and now working in a school is that a lot of schools are not quite prepared to have these type of conversations yet, because the people that work in school, for example, your counselors, your social workers, your teachers, most of the times when they are in school, preparing to become a teacher or a social worker or a counselor, they only had minimum experience or training on multicultural conversations or having that, you know, multicultural competency. So I think it's really up to us to encourage your school, your children's school, to facilitate these type of conversations and encourage these conversations to happen. Reach out to your schools, reach out to your children's teachers, reach out to the school counselor, reach out to the principal. Do whatever we can to have these type of conversation happen and encourage the students to be proud of who they are and to continue and facilitate these type of conversations in mainstream American schools to better support our Chinese American students.
Great, thank you so much. Like, you definitely provided the perspective of a future educator. Although you are still, doing your schooling, it sounds like you've been you've been thinking so much about this. And next up, I think we have like a colleague, almost like a colleague of yours, right, Michelle?
Hi, everybody. Wow, I have so much to say, so I'm going to do my best to keep it 5 to 6 minutes. So hi, everyone. I think, some of you may already recognize me because I feel like I've come to so many PCE events, and I always love coming here because it's so wonderful to share with all of you all and hear your questions and everything. So if you have questions for me, I'm happy to spend some time after this and just chill and hang out and talk with everybody. But like I said before, my name is Michelle. I'm a senior at Rutgers University, cultural anthropology major and journalism minor, and I'm hoping to pursue human rights law after I graduate. So I kind of said in my sign up that I'm open to talk about whatever, but I've noticed that a lot of people already covered some things, so I'll try and address some things that I saw in the chat and things that I think would be most helpful for the audience here. So a fun fact for me about being Chinese American, I noticed that a lot of people were talking about Chinese American identity as if it's a problem. And while I do think that there are many challenges that we face because of Chinese American identity, I have to say that my fun fact is I really love being Chinese American. I am so, so proud of it. I think it took me a while to get to this point. But since then, like, I've just been so happy to be part of this culture, to be eating like delicious food all the time, to have such a beautiful language. And I talk about it a lot. I think about it a lot. I mean, my major is about culture and the study of culture. But I really love being Chinese American. I love studying China as like a political entity. And I love thinking about Chinese culture and Chinese history. And I think what was really key for me to get here was starting to hang out with with other Chinese Americans and becoming more comfortable with like speaking Mandarin in public and things like that. And a lot of like structural change as well. So I noticed before, Alan talked a lot about, strength and, the individual's responsibility to be able to kind of handle what life throws your way. And I 1000% agree with that, but I also want to provide a little bit of a different perspective, because I think as parents and as a community, we also have a responsibility to create some structural change. Because you can tell anybody like, oh, you need to be strong, but it's also about like, well, what can we do together as a community to like, make it so that kids don't need to always have their barriers up, because I think that's a really unfortunate way to have to grow up. And I don't think the world should be, as cruel and hateful as it is. And I think that if we're to come together, we can definitely change that. So what can you do? Jinmu talked about this a little bit earlier, with getting more involved in like the education system and everything like that. When I was in high school, I was really determined. I lobbied the Board of Education of my town for 2 years to recognize Lunar New Year as an official district holiday. And at the end of the 2 years, I was a senior and I graduated, so I didn't get to enjoy the fruits of my labor, but it worked. So I've been out of high school for, oh my goodness, I've been out of high school for like, what, 4 years now? Time goes by so quickly, I didn't even realize. But for the past 4 years, like students have had off on Lunar New Year to be able to actually like celebrate that with their families and like sit down and, be able to make food with their families, watch the like Chinese like TV, like you know what I'm talking about, the TV broadcast. It's so wonderful every time, and like just engage in that culture. And it's something that I didn't have access to, but I made it my mission to ensure that other children in the community would be able to have access to that. And I think, you know, you can also take it a step further. I mean, there is so much Asian American activist history. We have a legacy in this country of activism, and we don't know about it. And that's why it's so hard for us to continue that legacy. But, you know, there were Japanese American activist women who were very involved with Malcolm X during the civil rights movement. And one of the first major lynchings, I think, on the West Coast was actually of a Chinese American man. So there are all of these like bits of history specifically about being Asian American. Like Asian American, it always feels as if it's a new identity, but the reality is that it's not. We have a history in this country and we belong here, and we deserve to feel like we belong here, but it's really important to even know that. So I would say for the parents, definitely take a look into educating yourself and talking to your kids about that, and then really push to make yourself visible in the local community. So with the Board of Education, pushing for like this kind of curriculum to be educated in these schools, because, you know, I think it's important to be able to sit down and have a conversation with your kid. Like, you're going to encounter a lot of racism and you are going to encounter a lot of exclusion. And there are people who are going to pull their eyelids at you and say awful things to you and make you feel like you are not allowed to be beautiful, you are not allowed to be successful, or if you are successful, it was expected of you anyway, so it's not really, you know, a triumph for you. There are going to be a lot of like moments like that. It's important to like be able to have that conversation with your child, but I think it's even more important to get involved in making sure that doesn't happen again, and it doesn't happen to more children. So I am going to try and wrap it up there. The last thing that I will say is I did notice that there was a question on the list about Asian Americans as a group with like other minority groups and our relationship with them. I want to draw everyone's attention to the recent hate crimes that have been popping up. I mean, really all over the country, very much in the West Coast, but also in the East Coast. And I think this should really encourage us to be leaning into advocacy and leaning into solidarity and learning more about what other minority groups are going through, because we are not the only immigrant group in America. And there's a lot that we can learn about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. They've been very, very effective in advocacy and in organizing. And I think the more that we're able to come together and respect other groups and work with them, the more progress we'll be able to make within our own communities as well. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions later, but I'll pass the mic now. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Your achievement with advocacy in high school, wow, that was inspiring. Next up, we have Mina and then Raynon. Thank you both for your patience. You know, we just have such like a vast feast today. Sorry, we are, you know, doing a little late on time, but Mina, thank you.
Yeah, of course. I'm Mina. I'm an econ undergrad at Columbia. So Alan, super cool to see another fellow Columbian. I'll just talk really fast, keep it brief because I know we're a little bit late. In terms of project, currently writing a book during my gap year on nonlinear living. So basically the idea behind the book is, yes, as Chinese Americans, we go after career prowess and we go after brand name schools, but after all of that, now what? And so that's like a really big question that I've seen happen after people get the career they want. So that's something I'm passionate about exploring. I'll link a little bit more details about the book in the chat. But also for Chinese heritage, I came to this group because of Miss Duan Lian, and we're currently co-boarding on the trustees at a K-12 Chinese immersion school. So that's kind of my stake in giving back to Chinese education right now, and it's something that's been really cool for me to learn about just from a school perspective, how we're educating our kids. So the spiel that I'm going to give today goes in two parts. Basically, the big takeaways are friendship with your kid and how to develop leaders. The first part, friendship, just to keep it brief, I was homeschooled up until high school, and my mom was pretty much my safe place, I would say, even throughout high school. And there's a lot of stories behind that, but ultimately I'm very grateful for my relationship with my mom because she was very supportive, I would say. And I guess the most defining feature in high school is that, like, you know, she'd pick me up from school before I could drive, and she would just let me vent about my friends and like what was going on. And one thing I was really grateful for is she would just listen. And sometimes it's really important to know that your kids just want to vent. They want to vent to somewhere. In high school, they're immature, they don't know what they're doing. Like their friends also don't know what they're doing. So it's really nice to be able to have an anchor in your family. And that starts from building a friendship with your kids so that they even feel comfortable in telling you like what's going on in their life. So like kind of an actionable to test out with your kid is also as a parent to kind of be aware, like how much is my kid telling me? And if you notice that your kid is talking a lot to their friends in a certain way, but like when you ask them, how's your day? And they're like, oh, it's fine. I guess the first thing is to identify like what your relationship with your kid is. And if it's like, I'm fine, then maybe there's something as a parent that you should be changing. And how to change that is like a completely different conversation. But being able to identify that you should be having a friendship with your kid, and ideally, like for me, like it was such a blessing in high school to be able to go to my mom when things were going poorly. That's something that she worked on a lot too. So it's like a lot of Chinese parents are always nagging their kid. That's like a defining quality of the relationship, just nagging, nagging, nagging. And as a kid, that like completely turns me off. Like I do not want to tell you anything if you're super annoying and like always talking to me about school. So also just like as a reminder, as kids, like we can tell when you ask us how our day is, like if it's because you really care about how our day is, or if it's because it's just because you want to tell us to like play violin or something like that. So also as a parent, being able to like, you know, ask how your kid is and hopefully like be genuine so that like, you know, they understand that it's because you care about them and like you care about their friends, you care about the drama they're going through. And as a parent, maybe you're like, oh, that's stupid. I don't really want to know about the drama. But like, no, like if your friend talks to you about drama, you would listen to it too. So being able to apply that a little bit more liberally with your kids as like, oh, maybe you don't care about what your kids like drama is, but at least you should pretend. And I think that's like kind of sometimes important in like friendships too. Like you don't always care what you're, you know, like there's a little bit of like, you know, treating your kid like an adult and that reciprocates in your kid being more open. Also, just as another action item, you as a parent sharing your own stories from when you were in college and high school is like super interesting for us to hear as well. So, yeah, like in friendships, it's usually like a mutual sharing. So as a parent, taking that step also to like, you know, like maybe your kid's really interested in you and you don't talk about that, or like, you know, you don't talk about it super frequently. I find that like a really great way to learn more about my mom and my dad, and it's very, very fulfilling on the child end. Whipping through because there's like 30 more seconds. In terms of leadership, we've talked a lot about like parenting strong Chinese Americans, and I think qualities that really stand out in the workplace and in succeeding in, you know, non-Asian environments are promoting creativity in your kids, especially because as Asian parents, like it's frequently like you're comparing kids and telling this like, oh, this kid went to Harvard, so do everything that kid did before. And as a kid, that really sucks because it's very uncreative. You know, you're just like following what other people have done in the past. But what we really need to be doing in our communities is to be promoting like Asian Americans to be thinking differently, creating new things, whether that's like companies or startups or whatever, like in artistry. It's a power, especially in the workplace, to be creating value, not to just do as you're told. And I think that starts in parents realizing too that they want to create children that, you know, ask questions and are like doing these things that are different. Can I take like 30 more seconds? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna take 30 more seconds. Other qualities that stand out are risk taking. Specifically, I think fear is a very predominating emotion in like Asian parents, you know, oh, you did that wrong, like fear. And like that's a very unmotivating emotion for kids. Like, oh, what if I don't get this test right? My mom's gonna yell at me. And especially that fear, like kind of extend childhood to like give risk, like usually Chinese are stereotypically like conservative. And that's because like we don't really try new things. We're afraid of messing up. Like what is that gonna look like on me? Like I'm gonna be a failure. And that also inhibits people to like discover their true passions and like, you know, how do I discover my true passions if I'm afraid of messing up? So these are just like some ideas just to spit out. If you guys have questions, I can like text back in the chat. And yeah, Hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you so much for the parenting advice, and also that last point about sort of, don't do a lot of like self-limit or self-doubting. All right, so last but not least, we have Raynon. So Raynon, please take the podium.
Thank you. My end, the internet seems to be a little slow. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Raynon. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm currently the student body president at Washington University in St. Louis, where I'm a sophomore. I'm studying political science and sociology. And I mentioned that earlier because I want to talk about leadership in my speech, along with race and our relationship with other racial groups and about parenting. My fun fact is that I've spent the past 5 years consulting with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia on parenting, so I hope I can also offer some interesting insights there about mental health and building those connections with your children. So first, I want to talk about what Alan spoke about earlier, this idea of victim mentality and race. And I really want to point this out because I think there's a difference between pointing out that race and other identities affect the way we are treated in society and letting that be the sole driver of how we act, right? I really want to focus on the fact that we can acknowledge that there is racism against Asian Americans. We know that we are viewed in certain ways when we go into certain rooms, and we know that we face these consistent racist actions across the board, right? We all share these different experiences that are very, very similar. The idea of people looking at our lunches and thinking that it looks gross. People who might look at us differently, who ask us if we have COVID-19 because of our skin color. This consistency in experience shows that there is a form of racism that we do all experience. So I think instead of shying away from that and trying to say that we need to live our lives ignoring that, we should address it head on and try to create the structural changes that many of our panelists have been talking about. On race, I really want to talk about a few pieces of this, right? Very similar to Michelle, I'm very proud of my Asian identity. And when I ran for student body president, I made it very clear that I'm someone who is both Asian and gay, and I'm at this school on a lot of financial aid. Those are all characteristics that I'm not shy about and things that I'm actually very proud about because I think they inform who I am and make me a stronger and more resilient person. And I want us to be able to acknowledge these identities because I think they all impact and inform the way that we are treated in society. And teaching our kids that they are growing up in a society that will look at them differently will be the best way to prepare them to be resilient in the face of that adversity. Because if you go into the world thinking that everyone's going to treat you just like everybody else, right? You're not preparing your kids for the real world where they will face discrimination and where they will face different forms of isolation. The second thing I want to talk about is there's a lack of genuine representation of, I think, Asian Americans in America as well. There's a stereotype that all Asian parents want their children to become doctors and engineers and lawyers. And we omit all the Asian students who want to grow up and become educators, who want to become human rights lawyers, who want to become politicians, who want to become artists, right? We lose out on a huge portion of the rich potential that our community offers if we segment ourselves into these very narrow categories. I think that embracing the fact that we need more Asian representation in media, in government, in positions of power, right, is how we can actually uplift Asian Americans as a whole and combat the structural racism that exists in the United States. Harvard even recently said that Asian Americans, even though we earn very high income, are the most underrepresented minority group in all of like business management. So while we can have really high paying, low level jobs, we don't ascend to the positions of power that many white Americans tend to. The third thing I want to talk about is that our activism should not subjugate others. So Asian American rights in the United States actually came from a lot of activism, like previous speakers mentioned, of Black people, of Latinx people, undocumented people, LGBTQ+ rights. The fact that our rights are tied to the liberation struggles of all people should cause us to be allies in their struggles as well, because I don't think any of us want to live in a society where you are oppressed and denied potential because of the way that you look, because of who you love, because of the gender that you are. And I think embracing this type of vision for the Asian community will both make us more politically engaged and make us more visible in the public sphere. The last thing I want to talk about in parenting is the distinction between helicopter versus lighthouse parenting. So helicopter parenting is a type of parenting where you know every single thing that your child does. I had a friend whose parents wrote all of his college application essays chose all the colleges that he was going to apply to and applied on his behalf. This was a little terrifying for me because that kid didn't really have control over his own life, right? Everything was kind of orchestrated by his parents. And as a result, because he was constrained, he always told me that he didn't feel like he was able to pursue his passions and find what he really loved in this life. Meanwhile, Lighthouse Parenting is what raises those strong values that Alan was talking about, right? The virtues of being able to be resilient, the ability to make ethical life decisions, the ability to lead a strong life that is guided by that moral compass. And being a Lighthouse parent means that you offer guidance, but you don't try to control every element of people's lives. Because at the end of the day, if your child wants to do something and your only response is don't do it without explanation or trying to guide them, that child will probably do it behind your back. And that's a really consistent trend we found at the Children's Hospital with children who just don't listen to their parents or just hide pieces of themselves. And if we want to have that vulnerability, like Mina mentioned, we have to be able to open up. The second thing I want to talk about is the conflation, I think, of strength with grit and resilience and weakness with vulnerability. I think that sharing struggles that we have as parents and as human beings is very natural because we aren't superhumans. When we experience hardship, we're going to feel pain, we're going to feel struggle, and to ignore and suppress that really opens the door to, I think, another problem in the Asian community, which is the mental health struggle. Just this year, I lost someone very, very close to me because of suicide. And that is because they didn't really have anyone to turn to because they felt their struggles had to be kept inside. And when they couldn't share it with anyone else, it just ate away at them. I think that for us to raise successful, healthy, and happy kids, we have to make sure that we also give them room to share. And the feeling that sharing something vulnerable about yourself doesn't make you a weak or bad person, but it's just making you a human being. If we want to raise healthy, productive, and moral children, I think we have to start at the roots of why we face discrimination and why we experience pain in the first place, and working together to build a society that reflects our values and allowing our children to flourish as themselves, as opposed to trying to fit them into these boxes that society has told us Asian Americans are.
Thank you so much, Rainan, and thanks, to all our youth panelists. From the chat, and I'm sure everyone feels the same way, we are just blown away by the talent and the passion we see in your generation. You are also articulate, so poised, so confident. Someone said, I see the hope.
So I'm 18 and I'm a senior in high school and I'm looking to go off to college soon. But my high school and my middle school have always been predominantly white institutions. So I haven't had a lot of mentors or other older Chinese Americans to look up to. So what I want to ask a lot of you is where did you start finding sources of mentorship, sources of guidance? Where did you guys start forming your own cohesive thoughts about your identity and how that relates to your political, your spiritual, your social, whatever beliefs? Because growing up in a very predominantly white area, I haven't had a lot of access to, I would say, things relating to my Chinese American identity.
So I think I heard most of what you were saying. I'm just going to recap really quickly for everybody who had struggle hearing, but she was saying that she's 18, about to go off to college, grew up in a very predominantly white area, and so hasn't had access to a lot of mentors. And she was asking the panelists where you first encountered your mentors or made those connections to make you feel more, comfortable with your identity. I will just start off by saying, girl, if you want to connect, if you need a mentor, if you need somebody, I got you. And I will give you my contact information if you want to message me on this app, on Zoom or whatever, and we can connect and we can talk and everything. I can be that person for you and you will be that person for somebody else and it will be wonderful. But I'll leave it there because I had a very long story in terms of how I came into being my own with my Chinese American identity. So I'll pass it off to any other panelists who want to talk about that and who they encountered, who they had for them.
I can say something just really quick because I also grew up in very predominantly white schooling settings in Omaha, Nebraska. And you know, until I went to college, I had never heard like the term person of color before. So suddenly going to college, everyone was like referring to me as like these different things. I was like, I don't know what this means. But I think it's been really helpful for me to embrace my Chinese American identity, especially by not only talking and interacting with other Chinese Americans, but other Asian Americans, other BIPOC people. And so I encourage you when you go off to college is just to really immerse yourself with as many different people of different perspectives as possible. Because I know that for us, we really like to be in comfort zone and like find people who look like us, who think like us, but I really encourage you to immerse yourself as much as possible and learn from everyone you can.